So I want to frame this in ticking through some years. And the first one is 2008. Of course, that was a big deal, an incredible year. The first black president, Barack Obama, was elected. And I remember if you're a person of color, it meant something to you more than you can actually describe. And if you're not a person of color, perhaps you probably don't get it. But I remember it being such a euphoric time. Also, a really controversial time in our church because there were some undercurrents bubbling under the surface of this time. And I remember feeling this disconnect. Why does there seem to be less, why are people less enthused, certain parts of our church less enthused about this than other parts? Okay, so in moving on from 2008, the next year I want to talk about is 2016. I remember a meeting that I was in the day after the election of 2016 happened. And I remember, and those of you who know Trey know that Trey is a very sort of nonplussed, steady as she goes, nothing bothers her. She just, I'm the one that's more emotionally like this, and she's steady. And she's not rocked by much, but I remember her crying that meeting. And or maybe it was the night before, but I think it was during the meeting. And I also remember talking to different members of our church and also people in the community hearing that their kids were crying and that it was very traumatizing, very off-putting, very upsetting, much more than is a typical election. With every election, some people are happy, some people are sad, but this one was different. It was outsized. And I remember feeling like it was a finger in the eye. Actually, more bluntly, I remember it felt like a middle finger to people that looked like me. That's what it felt like. And I remember talking to different people that are my friends, that love me more than I deserve, who have helped us raise our kids, helped our kids grow and become Christians and be strong in the faith, and helped us in our marriage, and people that would give anything for us, that we love dearly, that dearly love us. And yet there was this disconnect that I felt and that we felt. It was sort of like, hey man, it's just an election, get over it. It's what's the big deal? I mean, every politician, it's always the lesser of two evils. It's not that big a deal. And I remember feeling this sense of, I don't know how to communicate with you what this means to me. And that sense of, am I crazy? They're not reacting the way I'm reacting. What's wrong with me? And it's that sense of, hey man, be spiritual. Like our citizenship is in heaven. It's not here. And don't get all caught up in politics. Let's keep our eye on the prize and let's be spiritual and focus on the eternal. And yeah, this world's messed up and sometimes bad things happen. So just do your thing, get over it. No one said that, but that was the vibe I felt. And it wasn't malicious. It was just clueless, it was one of those. But I remember there was one guy, and he's white, and he called me that day. He said, hey man, I just want to see how you're feeling. And I appreciated it. And he said, my heart is broken. And he said, he doesn't vote. He's like, I won't vote. I don't vote because it's so corrupt and messed up. He said, I cannot believe that our country elected such an indecent, amoral, immoral man. It was very upsetting. Now, what's happened is that I have had subsequent conversations through the years with people of color. And to a person, people have talked to me about how traumatizing and how just off-putting and how devastating and soul-killing that reality was. Okay, so now take that vibe or undercurrent or inner turmoil. And by the way, I know God is in control. I know Jesus is the answer. I know the enemy is not flesh and blood. I know all of those things. Those things notwithstanding, I'm telling you how it affected me. And the reason I'm sharing this is I would bet you that the majority of the people of color that you shepherd and love felt the same way. But now flash forward to 2020. I would say that though we've not all been exposed to racial hatred, the racial hatred that we've seen this year in our country has exposed us all because it's shown our level of sensitivity to it. Because it's been the norm for so long, we say things like, hey, well, we should be grateful. Hey, if you don't like America, you should leave it. Or things are so much better than they used to be, as though those things make the truth any different. And so the author of Stamped from the Beginning, Ibram Kendi, he refers to three different kinds of people when it comes to dealing with racist ideas in the United States. And we've been studying through Stamped from the Beginning. One of them is a segregationist, or what we would call a racist, who's someone that blames racial disparity or racial inequity on the inherent inferiority of black people and the inherent superiority of white people. Then an anti-racist is someone who blames the racial disparity on discriminatory practices and not on inherent qualities of black people or any other race. And then the third category is an assimilationist, which has a little of both, who blames racial discrimination, but also feels as though it's the black person's job to assimilate into the broader dominant culture, which happens to be white. Now, those are oversimplifications. But what I would say is that I have thought in terms primarily of being an anti-racist, but also in being an assimilationist, or you could say an accommodationist. I realize now that I've been conditioned to accept unfair treatment of people of color as normal, and even someone who I'm not consciously okay of it, subconsciously I've become accepting of it. And I think we as a society have become accepting of it. And what God has been doing through these past few months is I am no longer okay accepting that. Derek and I are the only black guys. And guess who, out of a staff of over 10 people, guess who the only two people are who've ever been profiled? Derek and me. And I talked to actually a black member in our church. This was sort of insult to injury. But I shared that same fact with him. And he said, well, I would need to know, were either you or Derek doing something suspicious? And it's that sort of self-hate, internalized racism that accepts the racist view of society, that people who are my complexion are inherently less trustworthy and have more of a propensity for being criminals. So I smile, it's not a laughing matter, but I just think that that's where we are. The point I'm trying to make is we've come to accept unfair, biased, brutal treatment of people of color. And the way that I feel in my heart is I feel a primal, subterranean, almost from another time or another lifetime, rage and anger. Those of you who know me all this time, you know I'm not an angry person, quote unquote, by nature, but I feel it. But I think that's how a lot of people of color feel. It's like, I don't want to talk about this because I'm going to end up needing to apologize for making you feel badly for my anger. But then I don't have anywhere to express how I feel in this relationship. It's really complicated. Yes, God is working. Yes, Jesus is the answer. And I am really angry at the state of this world. And honestly, I had a naive view of our country. So at this point, there has been so much progress that has been made, and the different diversity teams and squads and efforts that we've all made, and letters of apology, and so many talks we've had trying to wrap our arms around this and figure out how to make a positive difference. And of course, we've got people in our churches, some of whom feel like, man, we've just begun to scratch the surface of this area, and we've got to stay on it. I remember Trey shared that back in the day in the early 90s when hope began, we would hear about hope all the time. It was spaced repetition just because it wasn't a natural habit of ours yet. And so in that sense, this issue of racial reconciliation, racial reckoning, being anti-racist, which is different than just not being racist, we need to stay on. Others feel like if I hear another Black Lives Matter message, I'm going to jump out of a window. Some people feel like if I hear another "don't worry about it, God is in control" message, I'm going to jump out of a window. So we've got the polarities, and how do we manage all of this? And how do we, those of us that feel angry, how do we make sure that we are angry but sin not, as Paul called the Ephesians to do in Ephesians chapter 4. So I just want to read a few verses that to me inform how to navigate this spiritually. And one of them is by King Lemuel in Proverbs 31. And he says, "Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Ensure justice for those being crushed. Yes, speak up for the poor and helpless and see that they get justice." And so there's that emphatic call. I want you to see to it that those that are oppressed get justice, and I want you to not be silent, but to speak up. And that's one of the deepest convictions and strongest takeaways I have from this whole season, is that silence is compliance. Silence leads to violence. And if people of faith had not been silent through the ages, the level of racism in our country would never have reached the level that it did. But people chose to look the other way. In Matthew 23, in the New Covenant, Jesus, on the 7 woes, verse 23 of Matthew 23, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You give a tenth of your spices, mint, dill, and cumin, but you've neglected the more important matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faithfulness. You should have practiced the latter without neglecting the former." And then he says, "You blind guides, you strain out a gnat and swallow a camel." You know, I was really proud of our church in putting out a letter in May saying that we are against racism and racial prejudice and racial injustice in the wake of the loss of those 3 dear souls and image bearers of God. And I just thought, we talked about the fact that it was a turning point in our church's history, and typically we have stayed apolitical and we've not commented on other issues that happened in the world. But I have come to the conviction and conclusion that that was wrong-headed. I'm not talking about it for anybody else, but for me, I can't any longer be that. And I'm reminded of a letter that was written by clergymen in Alabama, April 12, 1963, and it was written to Martin Luther King while he was in jail. And it was the predicate for his famous letter from a Birmingham jail, which is a work of literary genius. Of course, these clergymen, they were concerned about law and order. So this letter was written, and it's called Alabama Clergyman's Letter to Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., April 12, 1963. And it says, "We, the undersigned clergymen, are among those who, in January, issued an appeal for law and order and common sense in dealing with racial problems in Alabama." And so in the letter, they went on to say there were 9 clergymen, there was 1 rabbi, and they began to express their displeasure with King's protests. And what they said is that we had discussed that there are proper channels to deal with these issues, and that the better way to do it is to go through the courts, through civil conversations and so forth. But now you're out here and you're causing unrest. Even though you are peaceful and your people are peaceful, certain people are protesting and rioting and so forth. And so there's unrest, and we've got to stand against that. So while your efforts, we understand how you feel, they're untimely and ill-informed. And so we're asking you to cease and desist. And I think that spirit is endemic of the church all too often. And in fact, we come from the Restoration movement. And so the churches of Christ in the 1960s were completely on the sidelines when it came to racial justice, when it came to the civil rights movement of the 60s, and weren't involved in it. And so what we see is that Christians and churches have figured out a way to look on the other side of the road when it comes to injustice and brutality that is done to different people, and in particular people of color. This ability to compartmentalize their lives, where they are upset about law and order, but they're not upset about the carnage that had been wrought on African Americans for all this time. And so Martin Luther King writes back this incredible treatise, this incredibly eloquent letter, and he talks about the fact that he's really disappointed. Birmingham had the highest rate of bombings of black families of anywhere in the country. It was the most racially segregated city in the country. These Christians had become accustomed to those things, and those things didn't really bother them on an emotional level, but it was the response, it was the demonstrations that bothered them. And King says this, he writes, I have reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white Christians' Council or the Ku Klux Klaner, but it's the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goals you seek, but I can't agree with you in your methods of direct action. And then he says this, which I think is relevant to this time: shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Then he says, I have heard numerous religious leaders of the South call upon their worshipers to comply with desegregation decisions because they are the law. But I have longed to hear white ministers say, follow this decree because integration is morally right and the Negro is your brother. And that's the beauty of studying history, is it gives you a context in which to put your current situation. And here, Martin Luther King is basically saying to these clergymen, to quote the words of King Jesus, you guys are straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel. You're upset about peaceful protests, while people that look like me are being brutalized, are being harmed, but you don't really, on a visceral level, you don't really care about that like you care about these peaceful protests. It reminds me of Jesus, all the times he would heal people on the Sabbath, and his opponents and the religious teachers and leaders would have such umbrage and outrage about healing on the Sabbath, but they completely miss the humanity of someone's life being saved and them being healed from a malady that had plagued them their whole lives. And I see the same thing, and I hear the same thing here in 1963 when King is saying, guys, people are being killed here. This is wrong. And they're missing the forest for the trees, and they're straining out those gnats of the protests, and they're swallowing the camel of the evil done against people that you would think they would know better than their brothers and sisters of color. And then I see that today among well-meaning people, even in our church. And you guys have noticed, and I've noticed, and I've been so offended by the anger and the dismissal and umbrage that people have expressed about Black Lives Matter. I had a member of my church say that Black Lives Matter is evil and it's part of this left-wing conspiracy. And once again, people strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. They're more upset about what is on a website than 80 Black people being killed over the past several years without arms, with impunity. And you know what? I'm for bringing everybody along and loving everyone. I don't want to lose anyone, but I am not going to indulge racial insensitivity, white fragility, soft racism, or just general indifference. We saw it here in the 60s with King. They're like, hey, I'm going to ignore the real problem and I'm going to focus on this other problem. We saw it with Black Lives Matter. The Black Lives Matter people, they're not perfect and neither are we. But you know what? They have more courage and more heroism, and they are willing to stand for what's right and make the world a better place and put themselves in harm's way much more than most of the Christians I know. In fact, pretty much all the Christians I know. And so I stand by Black Lives Matter. I support them. I salute them as heroes. I pray to have the courage that they have. And that doesn't mean I agree with everything they believe or do, but I refuse to strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. And I refuse to enable my friends that are in the church to do the same thing. Another example is Colin Kaepernick. Kneeling. He's kneeling to protest police brutality against Black people. And the occupant of the White House calls all these guys that are kneeling SOBs. And there's this outrage. They're disrespecting the flag, and they were never disrespecting the flag, and they knew that. But it was a common racist co-optation, red herring tactic to deflect from the real issue is you have Black people being killed and you don't care. And so now all of a sudden, because of a video taken by a 17-year-old girl showing a 21st century lynching of George Floyd, now everybody is awakened. And now it's okay to kneel. But I see that same thing happening. It happened in 1963, and it's happening in 2020 when people that are from the dominant caste, people that are from the dominant race and culture, figure out a way to look away from the real issue and to not only not care about the problem of Black people, but then to make us feel like it's our problem and gaslight. And that's what often people do. Put all of your emotional energy into something so that you don't have to look at the sin and the evil either in your own heart or in the hearts of people that look like you. And so I want to leave you with this. I read an article called The New Reconstruction in the Atlantic magazine, October 2020, and it said that this is a turning point in history. There has never been an anti-racist majority in the United States. It says there may be one now. And so that's the opportunity we have. But we've got to be willing to deal with the tension that's there and not turn away from it.